Welcome and thanks for watching my video. Please like the video, leave a comment, subscribe if you appreciate this content. I've been making a lot of nuclear war simulation videos. I've done conflicts with Israel against various Middle Eastern nations, including Iran before, but I wanted to do another video kind of based on what we learned from this most recent Iranian-Israeli conflict that included the United States. So on this scenario, this would be sometime in the next year or so. Due to the recent strikes, Iran has decided that their number one priority is to finish developing some viable nuclear warheads. In this one, they're going to have 3 warheads developed from what they've enriched so far. These are going to be considered quote unquote dirty bombs. And they're going to have approximate yields similar to the atomic bombs that were dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in World War II. And these are going to be detonated kind of on the ground, so to speak. Now they would have different options to use. We've seen their ballistic missile attacks. Israel has spent a lot of their interceptors. Nobody has it's classified how many they actually have, but based on cost and a lot of other factors, you can understand that it's going to be of a limited nature. And we started to see more and more ballistic missiles on the Iranian side having gotten through towards the end of the conflict, although it was never a very high penetration rate. But even the best ballistic missiles defenses can be overwhelmed with a relatively modest attack. And I say relatively modest compared to what, say, like a China ballistic missile attack they could with their numbers in Southeast Asia. So, but in this, so they could have different options, but this one we're going to go with smuggled kind of quote unquote suicide bombers, and then we'll see an Israeli retaliation. So if we look, what would cause it to go past the nuclear threshold? Now, Israel has a long history of what I consider, what many people would say maybe a disproportionate response. So you punch them, they shoot you. You stab them, they blow you up. It's not in to get into the why or any of the geopolitics behind it, because I always say there's no good guys and bad guys when it comes to geopolitics. There's just a lot of ugliness. But what we will focus on is, okay, what could be the casualties with these dirty bombs, and then a retaliatory strike by Israel. So if Israel were to strike first, they would become, more of a pariah than they necessarily are, cross that nuclear threshold. It's a big threshold. Nobody's done it since the initial, bombings in World War II. But there could be a plausible thing that if nuclear weapons were detonated in their soils, killing a lot of their population, that you very well could see a response that may look something like this. This is not utilizing and again, Israel's never acknowledged that they have a nuclear force. It's the world's worst kept secret. But this would be using approximately about 1/3 of their arsenal. And it'll be a mix of some airstrikes utilizing F-35s and some of their own Jericho ballistic missiles with nuclear tipped warheads. Not utilizing their subs. So we're going to run through that all. So bear with me for 1 second. Okay, sorry. Sometimes my other professional life, which is not my professional life making these videos, I have to stop and do a few things. So let's go ahead and start with those detonations. So these detonations will be in their most populated areas and also of historical significance. So we're going to start with those dirty bombs. So we're going to do one in Tel Aviv, one in Jerusalem, and don't want to leave this one out. So those will be the 3 dirty bombs. Let's go ahead and take a look now. The Israeli counterstrikes, counterforce, taking out military sites here through airstrikes. And then the counter value will be attacks on population centers. So we'll go ahead and run this And we realistically we would look at more of the airstrikes launching first, but just this way the sim works, we're going to see right the ballistic missiles getting there first, the counter value strike. But just the nature of the simulation, I didn't want to make the stretch this out by having the airstrikes go because they're a little slower. But just think of this being a more real time thing. So let's go ahead and execute all plans. Oh, let me take those off. And let's go ahead and run this in 10 times speed. So you see the jets taking off here, and we should start seeing the ballistic missiles starting to fire shortly. So we're starting to see those fire. So this is clearly, a nightmare scenario, even if this wouldn't have a direct immediate impact, say if you're in the United States, but there's no way nuclear weapons are being utilized that doesn't have an impact across the world. This is really a threshold that, must never be crossed. And unfortunately, it seems to be moving in the opposite direction. We saw a lot of headway made in the 80s with deterrence, reduction of sizes, and we're moving into the opposite direction. There's be an entire series of videos on why we're seeing that. Now we're starting to see some of the warheads breaking off from the rockets. We're still going to see these fighter jets coming here. Israel does not currently have any strategic bombers, although we have made a recent pushing through a bill, the United States, I should say, of providing Israel with the GBU 57 MOPs, penetrator bombs, massive ordnance penetrators. And it does say a clause about a strategic bombers providing to be utilized in the event of an imminent nuclear strike. So what that means, it's unlikely, I would say very unlikely the United States would provide necessarily a B-2 or a B-21. But again, you don't want to say anything 100%. Would that be a B-52? Those are not stealth. They're very viable as for standoff nuclear cruise missiles, but they wouldn't be as viable, although, a weakened air defense systems with a lot of escorts, and they could potentially still be utilized. But like the United States, we use the stealth bombers for a reason. So I'm going to speed things up a little bit for the fighter side because, like I said, they're a little bit slower. They got to get closer. These are not cruise missiles they're dropping. They're more quote unquote dumb bombs. So they have to fly over top of the target and drop it. Not too dissimilar to the GBU 57. Not quite dumb bombs. I mean, they are, I should say the GBU 57 I wouldn't say is a dumb bomb per se. But it's not like a standoff cruise that can be launched from distance away. It's interesting. Chinese military assessments place the greatest air danger from the United States not in the stealth bombers, the B-2 or the soon-to-be operational B-21, but it's actually the B-52, the one that's been around for decades and probably another going to be around for several more decades, probably because of the sheer number of standoff cruise missiles that they could launch. So we see now striking military targets. And of course, it's not going to be wholly separated. Some of these locations are separate from population centers, but there is some overlap. We see already quickly kind of a devastating effect. You know, with all the missiles that were sent to Israel, all being conventional from the Iranian side during this recent conflict, and enough got through that, there's certainly a lot of building damage, but the actual number of dead, relatively small amount. It's not a small amount if it's loved one's family, but of course, again, in conflict, I mean, you could speak the same for the amount of people in Gaza Strip and stuff being killed. Point being that not to say that 20 or 30 dead is not a big deal, but overall, the number of casualties for those bombs is relatively low. We will see with nuclear strikes, the casualties with Israel will be infinitely higher. Okay, so these guys are just kind of making their way back. Nothing more is really going on, so let's run some casualties real fast. Okay. Here's what we're going to see right away, casualties. And unfortunately, we see even a non-combatant in this sense, Azerbaijan, 2,632 dead, likely from fallout. We see Israel, 301,000 dead from 3 relatively lower yield bombs, 3.7% of their population. And Iran, which had much more warheads dropped on it, 10 million, 12, almost basically say 13% of their population. Of course, that's immediate deaths. You're going to have another almost 500,000 cancer fatalities. So that increase in Azerbaijan going from, almost to 9,000 at that point. And then we see, I don't like the way this one scrolls. It kind of takes a second, but let's get down so we can at least see Israel and Iran. So Iran's going to have another 486,000 cancer fatalities, potentially. Again, this is a simulation. They're not showing that with Israel, more than likely due to the fact that lower yield in the target area was mostly just going to be casualties. But we're looking, so overall, all total across all of them, we're looking at 10.5 million immediate casualties, another 500,000, 423,000 square kilometers evacuated. Let's take a look at some of the long-term fallout. And we see a significant pattern. That's where, like I said, you start to see those casualties in another country because of the fallout and the crossover. Now, there's ways they could potentially mitigate some of that based on the wind patterns at the time, where they strike at, and would they go through that? Again, that's kind of hard to say. And then Israel, like I said, you see a much smaller pattern due to the nature of those bombs. But for both countries, it would be a significant impact. Those countries, as they stand now, would probably cease to be potentially functioning as they do. I mean, you can imagine for a country like Israel, size 300,000 of their population, especially in their most major cities, huge impact. And then you could, potentially see the impact of certain paramilitary forces and ways they could potentially exploit them or rebuild their own forces. I mean, I know Hamas is in dire straits, depending on what you look at, but what I've been reading and stuff says that there's a lot of like more independent gangs kind of taking control of certain areas of Gaza. But again, I don't want to get too far into that. That's a whole other thing. But one possible scenario outcome, again, simulations aren't to tell you what will happen. It's just to model what could happen under different sets of parameters, set of circumstances. Where does it go from there? Of course, um, do other countries get involved? Would the U.S. utilize any nuclear forces? It would only take one U.S. sub um, to cause a huge impact. Let's just say I'm going to do this real quick and quote unquote dirty way, lack of a better term. So let's, and I usually always do the targeting. Why am I? Yeah, maybe it's, what, I think it's just the nature of this. I usually always do the manual targets, but I'm just going to do a quick one. Let's do counter value. Let's look at, so this is just going to be one of our ballistic missile subs. Let's go ahead and hit it just so we see. this off so we don't see it. And this is just to give a perspective of even how it could potentially escalate. And that's not counting any other nuclear armed countries. Nobody's going to be happy with nuclear weapons being detonated. It destabilizes the entire world. No doubt about it. Let's just go a little faster since this is just really a exercise in the absurd, I would almost say at this point. Because I still feel strongly that any nation crossing a nuclear threshold is always going to be a very low probability because of the danger involved in it. Even during the Cold War, when tensions were extremely high, cooler heads prevailed. All right, let's just go ahead and run through those casualties again. So now, doubled the Iranian casualties, 25% of their population now. Huge impact. And I know somebody's going to say, well, what about, Russia? So I'm just going to show now quickly. Just in the sake of fairness, again, this is an exercise in the absurd. This is not meant at this point. The initial Israeli-Iran conflict was trying to be modeled in some sense of realism. This is more of a thing. So what if Russia now decided to do the same but strikes Israel? And again, exercise in absurdity. I get it. But just to take a look. So now we're going to see the same thing, but on the flip side. So let's go ahead and do that. You can actually see the trajectory coming down here. Let's just zoom into this. Let's just zoom in so you get a better idea of this impact. Absolute nightmare, right? It's always something when you see it more close up like that. Take this off. Let's do casualties at this point. So now, of course, the casualties spread much further out, more countries impacted. Israel, 33% of their population, 2.6 million. Absolutely devastating. And of course, it would have a big impact on Palestinians just for proximity. Jordanians, 8.1% of their population. Syria's going to have an impact. So, again, not, United States and especially Russia then getting involved, not meant to be a realistic thing. It's really just a model. Any sort of level of escalation like that, and how casualties would just increase exponentially at that point. So what was it worldwide, all in, with cancer fatalities and the initial deaths? I mean, you're looking over 28 million dead. Long term, even grow from there. So it's a scenario. If you haven't seen it yet, check out my U.S.-Iran war project. I actually started that prior to this most recent conflict, but I've got a series of videos. Check it out if you like it. It's utilizing command modern operations. It's utilizing the GMT games Next War Iran kind of board war game, utilizing combat mission shock force, DCS world for flight simulation. So it's using all these different simulations to drive a narrative campaign. And I've just started it. I've only done a couple videos. I paused it while the conflict was going on because I didn't feel it was right to put out videos like that while the conflict was actually going on. Now that it's kind of died down, quote unquote, I've resumed it. So there'll be a link to those videos in the comments, or you should see it pop up at the end for the playlist. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.